A work-obsessed billionaire CEO gets a late-night call from an unknown number. "Dad, it's me." Initially thinking it's a prank, he freezes in shock at what the boy at the end of the line says next. Victor Morgan leaned back in his leather chair, the glow of the city skyline spilling into his penthouse office. The muted hum of his state-of-the-art air conditioning system was the only sound accompanying the quiet symphony of numbers on his screen. His mind, sharp and methodical, focused on forecasts and projections, tools that had built his empire. It was late, but late nights were Victor's specialty. Time blurred when you were crafting the future. He stretched, his shoulders stiff from hours of work. A glance at the clock revealed it was well past midnight. Sleep could wait. There was always another deal to review, another problem to solve. Reaching for his coffee mug, now cold and forgotten, Victor was startled by the sudden vibration of his phone on the sleek glass desk. The screen illuminated with an unfamiliar number. He frowned, debating whether to answer. His personal number was closely guarded, known only to a select few. It could be important, but it could just as easily be a mistake. Hesitation gave way to curiosity, and he swiped to answer, bringing the phone to his ear. "Hello?" His voice was calm, professional. For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Victor's brow furrowed, and he was about to hang up when a hesitant voice finally spoke. "Dad? It's me." The words hung in the air like a dropped glass, shattering the quiet calm of his office. Victor froze, the unfamiliar weight of those 3 words catching him off guard. "I think you have the wrong number," he said, his tone firm but measured. "No," the voice replied, shakier now, but resolute. "I don't. You're Victor Morgan. My mom. She told me about you." A chill ran through Victor. He sat up straighter, gripping the edge of his desk. This had to be a prank. But something about the voice, it was young, maybe a child, and there was a sincerity to it that was impossible to ignore. "Look, kid," Victor said, his voice clipped with irritation. "I don't know what this is about, but I'm not your father. Whoever put you up to this made a mistake." The silence that followed was deafening. Victor could almost hear the child breathing, steady but tense. Then, the voice came again, softer, but with an edge of vulnerability that made him pause. "Mom said you might not believe me. She said you wouldn't want to hear from me. But she told me your name, your company, how you built Morgan Enterprises. She told me you used to live in Brookhaven before everything. That's where I grew up, too." Brookhaven. Victor's stomach tightened. That small town was a relic of his past, one he had buried under years of ambition and success. Few people from that time were still in his life. His mind raced, unearthing memories of faces, names, and places he'd long left behind. "Who are you?" Victor asked, his voice quieter now, less certain. "My name's Jake," the boy said. "I'm 12. Mom always said you didn't know. That you left before she could tell you." Victor leaned back, his grip tightening around his phone. His pulse quickened as questions flooded his mind, colliding with disbelief. This couldn't be real. It had to be a scam. But how could anyone know about Brookhaven, about the life he'd led before climbing the corporate ladder? The details were too precise, too personal. "Listen," Victor said, trying to regain control of the conversation. "I don't know who put you up to this, but I don't have a son. You've made a mistake." Jake's voice cracked on the other end. "You don't believe me. Mom said you might not. She always said you were busy, that you had your own life now. But she also said I should try. That maybe you'd care." Before Victor could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone in his hand, the last words echoing in his ears. The weight of them was suffocating, pressing against his carefully constructed reality. He placed the phone down slowly, his thoughts a storm of doubt and unease. This was absurd. It had to be. Yet, the boy's voice lingered in his mind, earnest, familiar in a way that felt impossible to place. He tried to push it away, returning his focus to the screen before him. But the words wouldn't leave him alone. Brookhaven. The name dredged up memories of a simpler, messier time. He thought of Claire, a woman he'd cared for deeply but left behind when ambition called him elsewhere. Could she? No, it was impossible. She would have told him. Wouldn't she? Victor rubbed his temples, frustration mounting. He had no patience for games, but something about that call gnawed at him. There was a part of him, a quiet, buried part, that wanted to believe Jake, to uncover the truth behind the voice on the other end of the line. Hours passed, but sleep never came. Victor stared out at the city skyline, his reflection in the glass a shadow of the man he used to be. A question lingered in the back of his mind, one he couldn't ignore. What if the boy was telling the truth? Victor sat at his desk, the city lights casting long shadows across the room. The phone call still echoed in his mind, no matter how hard he tried to push it aside. The boy's voice, that uncertain but determined tone, refused to let him go. It was probably a mistake, some coincidence, yet something about it clung to him like an old, forgotten memory. He stood abruptly, walking to the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. This was his world now, high-rise offices, board meetings, and strategic partnerships. Brookhaven was a lifetime ago, a chapter he had closed and buried. And Claire. Claire was a name he hadn't spoken in years. Could it really be her? Victor shook his head and ran a hand through his hair, muttering under his breath. He was being ridiculous. It was just a prank. Some scam artist fishing for money. But the boy hadn't asked for anything, just for him to listen. And the details, they were too precise. Brookhaven. Morgan Enterprises. Claire. Claire. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to think back to those wild, youthful days. She had been the one person who made him feel grounded when he was still figuring himself out. Their relationship was a whirlwind, full of late-night drives, stolen kisses under the summer stars, and whispered promises of forever. But forever never came. His ambitions had pulled him away, further and further, until Claire was just another memory buried beneath deals and deadlines. Victor sat back down, exhaling sharply. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to check. Just to put it to rest. He reached for his office phone and dialed a familiar number. "Lena," he said when his assistant answered groggily. "I need you to look into someone for me." Discreetly. There was a pause. "Sir, it's almost 3 a.m. "I know," he said, his voice sharp but uneasy. "I need it done first thing in the morning. Her name is Claire Thompson. She lived in Brookhaven about 13 years ago. See if you can find anything. Old addresses, family connections, anything." Lena hesitated but knew better than to question him when he was in this mood. "Understood. Anything specific I should look for?" Victor's jaw clenched. "Just let me know if you find anything unusual." He hung up before she could ask more questions. Running a hand down his face, he tried to dismiss the gnawing unease, but it only seemed to settle deeper in his chest. The next day passed in a blur of meetings and deadlines, but his mind remained stuck in the past. Every free moment, his thoughts wandered to Claire. To what could have been. To the possibility that he had a son, an idea so absurd, so foreign, yet it refused to leave him alone. By late afternoon, Lena walked into his office, a folder in hand and a cautious look on her face. She placed it on his desk and cleared her throat. "There's not much, sir," she said. "Claire Thompson left Brookhaven a few years after you did. No current records, no social media presence. Just gone." Victor frowned, flipping through the papers. There were old addresses, work records, and a single grainy photo of Claire from a local newspaper event years ago. She looked older but still had the same warmth in her eyes. He swallowed hard. "And her family?" he asked, keeping his voice even. "She had a son. A boy named Jake," Lena said carefully, watching his reaction. "But there's no father listed on any records I could find." Victor's fingers froze on the page. There it was. Jake. The name from the call. He stared at it for a long moment, the weight of it pressing down on him. His mind raced with questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. "Anything else?" he asked, his voice quieter now. Just one thing, Lena said hesitantly, pointing to a highlighted section. Claire passed away a few years ago. The records say she died from an illness, but there's nothing more detailed than that. Since then, Jake's been, well, the reports say he's been moving around. No consistent guardian. He's been in and out of the system. Victor's stomach twisted. He closed the folder and leaned back in his chair, his mind whirling with thoughts he never imagined he'd be dealing with. Claire was gone. And if what the boy said was true, he'd been alone all this time. You think it's possible, sir? Lena asked, her voice unusually soft. That he's yours? Victor let out a slow breath, his gaze fixed on nothing in particular. I don't know, he admitted. I honestly don't know. But deep down, there was a growing part of him that wasn't so sure anymore. That night, Victor found himself sitting in his penthouse, staring at the folder like it held all the answers to questions he never thought he'd have to ask. He poured himself a drink, but it did nothing to quiet his thoughts. Brookhaven. Claire. Jake. The memories felt closer than they had in years. He could almost hear Claire's laughter, see the way she looked at him when she thought he wasn't watching. Had she really kept this from him? Had she thought he wouldn't care? He reached for his phone, scrolling through the call history. The unknown number still sat there, staring back at him. He considered calling it back, demanding answers. But something held him back. What if it was true? What if the life he had built so carefully was about to be unraveled by one late-night phone call? Victor didn't sleep that night. Instead, he sat with the weight of the past pressing against him, uncertain of what his next step should be. By morning, he knew one thing for sure. He needed answers. And he wouldn't stop until he found them. Victor had spent the past few days buried in work, or at least that's what he told himself. His calendar was filled with back-to-back meetings, strategy calls, and endless reports, but no matter how much he tried to focus, his mind kept drifting back to the call. Jake. The name echoed in his head like a song stuck on repeat, nagging at him with an uncomfortable persistence. He told himself that the first call was probably a scam, but after what Lena had found, doubt gnawed at him. The thought that Claire might have hidden a child from him, a son, made it impossible to think about anything else. And yet, he hadn't called the number back. Maybe it was fear. Fear of opening a door to something he wasn't ready to face. But he wouldn't have to call. Because 3 nights later, the unknown number lit up his screen again. Victor stared at the phone, his heart hammering in his chest. His finger hovered over the answer button, and for a moment, he considered ignoring it. But before he could talk himself out of it, he swiped the screen and brought the phone to his ear. Hello? His voice came out sharper than intended, but he didn't care. Dad? Please. I need your help. The voice on the other end was the same, young, uncertain, but this time, there was something else. Fear. Victor's grip on the phone tightened. Jake, right? He asked, forcing himself to keep his tone steady. What's going on? Where are you? There was a shuffling sound, and Jake's voice came back, more frantic now. Mom said you'd come if I needed you. She always said, but I... He cut himself off, his breathing quick and uneven. Victor's throat tightened. Calm down. Just tell me what's happening. Are you safe? I don't know, Jake whispered. I can't stay here anymore. Please, I don't have anyone else. Victor felt something stir deep in his chest, something foreign and unwelcome. Concern. Where are you? He asked again, more forcefully this time. Jake hesitated, and then, just as he began to say something, the line cut out. Victor pulled the phone away and stared at the screen. Call disconnected. Damn it! He shot up from his chair, pacing the length of his office. This was more than a prank now. There was something real happening here, and the kid was scared. With a sigh, he grabbed his phone and dialed Lena. She answered groggily, no doubt exhausted from the hours she'd put into tracking Claire down. Lena, I need you to trace that number from the other night, he said, not bothering with pleasantries. There was a pause. Sir, I already looked into it. she replied hesitantly. The number's registered in Brookhaven, but it's a prepaid burner phone. No way to track an exact location. Brookhaven. Again that name. He could picture it, the old streets, the diner where he and Claire used to get coffee, the little bookstore she loved. He hadn't thought about that place in years, but now it felt like a tether pulling him back. Can you find anything else? He asked, frustration creeping into his voice. I'm afraid not, Lena said. But, sir, if you want my advice, maybe you should go there yourself. If the boy's telling the truth, he might not have much time. Victor sank into his chair, rubbing his temples. The thought of leaving the comfort of his world to dig into a past he had long abandoned felt absurd. But something inside him whispered that this wasn't just about curiosity anymore. I'll handle it, he said and ended the call. That night, Victor packed a small bag, feeling oddly out of place in his own home. The thought of going back to Brookhaven left him uneasy, but he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in his gut. He needed to see this through, if not for the boy, then for his own peace of mind. The drive to Brookhaven was long and filled with a heavy silence that pressed in around him. His mind was a battlefield of doubt and regret. As he crossed into familiar territory, old memories flickered to life, the winding roads, the little shops, and the house Claire once called home. He parked outside the old diner they used to frequent. It looked the same, maybe a little more rundown, but still familiar. Stepping inside, he was met with the comforting scent of coffee and warm pastries. A few patrons glanced at him curiously, but he ignored them, heading straight to the counter. Excuse me, he said to the waitress behind the register. I'm looking for someone. A boy named Jake Thompson. The woman, probably in her 50s, studied him with wary eyes. Jake? She repeated, wiping her hands on a rag. He's a sweet kid, but he's had a rough go of it since his mama passed. Why were you looking for him? Victor hesitated. I think I might be able to help him, he said carefully. The waitress eyed him for a moment longer before nodding toward the back door. He hangs around behind the diner sometimes. But be careful, mister. That boy's had his fair share of disappointments. Victor nodded his thanks and made his way outside. His heart was hammering in his chest now, but he forced himself to stay calm. He scanned the alleyway, and after a few moments, he spotted a small figure sitting on the curb, arms wrapped around his knees. Jake? Victor called softly. The boy's head snapped up, and even in the dim light, Victor could see the resemblance. It was like looking into a mirror of his younger self, dark hair, sharp eyes, and that same guarded expression. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, the weight of uncertainty hanging between them. Then, Jake stood slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. You actually came. Victor swallowed, nodding once. Yeah. I did. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure if he was stepping into something he could handle. Victor stood awkwardly in the alley behind the diner, the faint hum of traffic in the distance, and the warm glow of the streetlights casting long shadows. Jake eyed him warily, his small frame tense as if ready to bolt at any moment. The weight of the moment pressed heavily on Victor's chest. He had faced ruthless boardrooms, outmaneuvered billion-dollar deals, and built an empire from nothing, but none of it had prepared him for standing in front of a boy who might be his son. Why'd you come? Jake asked, his voice quiet but edged with something defensive, something fragile. Victor swallowed, unsure of what to say. I needed answers, he admitted. Your call, it caught me off guard. I just want to understand. Jake shrugged, kicking at a loose piece of gravel. Yeah, well, most people don't stick around long enough to care. Victor sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm not most people, he said, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Can we talk somewhere? Jake hesitated, then jerked his head toward the diner. There's an old friend of my mom's who works here. She might tell you what you want to know. Victor followed Jake inside, feeling the gazes of a few lingering customers on them. The same waitress he had spoken to earlier looked up and stiffened slightly when she saw Jake by his side. Well, she said, wiping her hands on a napkin. Jake, you all right? I'm fine, Miss Patty, Jake said with a forced nonchalance. He's looking for my mom. Patty's eyes narrowed, flicking between them before she sighed and leaned against the counter. Come on, let's sit. Victor slid into the booth across from her while Jake took the seat beside him, arms crossed over his chest. Patty studied Victor for a long moment, then spoke in a softer tone. So you're him. Claire used to talk about you, you know, she said, her eyes holding a quiet sadness. Said you had big dreams, that you'd moved on to bigger things. Victor nodded, feeling a sharp pang of guilt. I didn't know, he said, his voice quieter. I didn't know about Jake, or what happened to her. Patty's gaze softened just a little. Claire was proud, Victor. Too proud, maybe. She wouldn't have reached out. After you left, she stayed in Brookhaven for a while. Worked at the bookstore, raised Jake the best she could. But things got tough. Victor's chest tightened. What happened? Patty sighed, glancing at Jake before answering. She got sick. Cancer. She fought it as long as she could, but it wasn't enough. Victor felt the air leave his lungs, the weight of guilt pressing heavier. He could picture Claire, the way she used to laugh so easily, the fire in her eyes when she talked about her dreams. And he had left her behind, oblivious to the life she had built without him. When did she? He trailed off, his voice breaking slightly. A little over 2 years ago, Patty said gently. Since then, Jake's been bouncing around. Some distant relatives took him in for a while, but it didn't last. He's been trying to make it on his own. She shot a pointed look at Jake. Even though he shouldn't have to. Victor turned to the boy sitting next to him, suddenly seeing him in a new light. The guarded expression, the way he carried himself like someone far older than his years, it all made sense now. Claire was gone, and Jake had been left to navigate the world on his own. Where have you been staying? Victor asked, his voice softer now. Jake shifted uncomfortably. Here and there, he muttered. I stay with Patty sometimes, but I don't want to be a burden. I can take care of myself. Patty frowned. You're a kid, Jake. You shouldn't have to. Victor stared at the boy, guilt gnawing at him. He had spent the past 12 years building a life of success, wealth, and influence, while his own son, if Jake truly was his, had been scraping by without a safety net. I had no idea, Victor said finally. Claire never told me. Patty gave him a sad smile. Like I said, she was proud. And she didn't want to disrupt your life. But Jake deserves better than this, Victor. The words stung. Victor looked at Jake again, and for the first time, the thought truly sank in. Could he have a son? And if he did, what did he do now? Jake, Victor said after a moment, his voice more controlled. Do you have any proof? That I'm your father? Jake hesitated, then reached into the pocket of his worn-out hoodie. He pulled out a small, crumpled envelope and handed it to Victor. Mom wrote this for you, he said quietly. She never sent it. I found it after she passed. Victor carefully opened the envelope, his hands surprisingly unsteady. Inside was a letter in Claire's familiar handwriting, faded but still legible. Victor, I never thought I'd have to write this, but here we are. You deserve to know the truth. His name is Jake, and he's yours. I didn't want to disrupt your life, but I always hoped you'd find your way back someday, even if it was just to know him. He's a good boy, Victor. He has your eyes. Your stubbornness too. And he deserves better than what I can give him now. I'm sorry for not telling you sooner. I hope you can forgive me. Victor read the letter twice, his eyes lingering on the final lines. His heart pounded against his ribs, a storm of emotions raging inside him. Claire had kept him in the dark, but she had wanted him to know, eventually. And now, standing in this diner with the boy who might be his, Victor knew that this was a moment he couldn't walk away from. He folded the letter carefully and looked at Jake, who watched him with an expression that was equal parts hope and skepticism. I don't know what to say, Victor admitted. But I'm here now. Jake shrugged, trying to look indifferent. I'm not asking for anything, he said. I didn't know what else to do. Victor nodded slowly, feeling a responsibility that he hadn't known was missing from his life until now. He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was clear, he couldn't walk away. Not this time. Victor sat in the dimly lit diner, the crumpled letter from Claire still clutched in his hand. The words blurred slightly as he stared at them, his mind reeling with emotions he wasn't ready to face. Across the table, Jake watched him cautiously, his guarded expression making him look far older than 12. Victor cleared his throat, placing the letter down with careful precision. She never told me, he said, more to himself than to Jake. Jake shrugged, fiddling with the edge of his worn hoodie. Yeah. I figured. She always said you had important things to do. She didn't want to mess that up. Victor's chest tightened at the words. Claire had always been selfless, sometimes to a fault. But had she really thought he wouldn't have cared? Or had he given her reason to believe it? The weight of his own choices pressed down on him harder than he expected. Jake leaned back in his seat, eyeing Victor with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. You're not what I expected, he admitted. Victor raised an eyebrow. What did you expect? The boy shrugged again. I don't know. Some guy in a suit who wouldn't care. You're in a suit though, so I guess I was half right. Victor couldn't help the small, humorless smile that tugged at his lips. I wear a lot of suits. Jake nodded. Yeah, Mom said you always looked sharp. But she also said you used to love driving around in that old red truck of yours. Victor blinked. He hadn't thought about that truck in years, the one he had driven across the country before selling it to fund his first business venture. The memories were bittersweet, but hearing them from Jake made them feel different. More real. You remember a lot of what she told you? Victor said quietly. Jake's face darkened for a moment, and he looked away. She told me stories. Said you were smart, and that you left because you wanted a bigger life. She never said anything bad about you. She just didn't want me to think you'd come back someday. But I guess I always hoped you would. Victor swallowed hard. Jake, I don't know what to say. I had no idea. If I had, you didn't. Jake cut him off, his tone flat but not angry. And I get it. But you're here now. That's gotta count for something, right? Victor wasn't sure if it did. He wasn't sure of anything anymore. Guilt and regret churned in his gut, making it hard to think clearly. All these years, he had convinced himself he'd left Brookhaven behind for good, but now he realized that part of him had been here all along, wrapped up in a boy who had been waiting for someone to show up. A voice interrupted his thoughts. Victor Morgan? He turned to see a woman standing beside the booth, her face lined with exhaustion but her eyes sharp. She was in her late 50s, her graying hair tied back in a neat bun. She gave Jake a concerned glance before shifting her attention back to Victor. I'm Marion, she said, holding out a hand. I was Claire's neighbor. Been looking after Jake when I can. Victor shook her hand, noticing the tired way she carried herself. Thank you for that, he said sincerely. Marion sighed and sat down in the booth across from him. Claire never wanted to ask for help, but she didn't have much choice near the end. I've done what I can, but I'm not family, and I can't do much more. Victor nodded, glancing at Jake, who was looking away, clearly uncomfortable with the conversation. He's been through a lot, Marion continued, her voice softer now. More than any kid should have to deal with. Claire was a good mother, but when she got sick, things got tough. There were bills. The kind of problems money could have fixed, but pride wouldn't allow it. Victor clenched his jaw. The realization of how different things could have been if Claire had reached out earlier hit him